Welcome back to this week's episode of Lindsay Bird and Writing is Hard. This week, we talk about writing a middle grade fantasy novel about anxiety. How can anxiety be depicted? What ways can these stories reach readers? And how can authors market to and interact with their younger audiences? All that and more. I hope you enjoy. Today's author interview is with Gloria Huang. Gloria is an author and a short story writer. She studied fiction writing and English literature at Stanford University, and she lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her short fiction has been accepted for publication in prestigious literary journals including the Southern Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, the Three Penny Review, Chicago Quarterly Review, Pleiades, and many more. Her debut middle grade novel, Kaya of the Ocean, was published in January 2025 and was selected as a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard, American Booksellers Indies Introduce, and American Booksellers Indies Next List Pick. Its backup book blurb reads, on the surface, 13-year-old Kaya leads a charmed life. She lives in beautiful beachy the Hiwai. She has ride-or-die best friends. She's ultra smart and killing it at school. She even works with a super cute boy at her parents' restaurant. But she also has anxiety, serious anxiety, the kind that makes you scratch and pick, and she's always had bad luck around the ocean. It's hard to enjoy Hawaiian beaches when you've almost drowned more than once. But as stranger and stranger things happen to Kaya around the sea, she realizes that, wanted or not, she has a special connection to it. Waves rise when she's angry, surf smooths when she's calm. Fish come when she calls them, and when she learns the truth about her family and her divine ancestor Matsu, she knows that she will need to connect with her most difficult emotions ASAP, or her potent powers may become dangerous to the people she loves. Kaya of the Ocean is an exciting, fresh, and beautiful middle grade fantasy about embracing who you really are. The heartfelt adventure of sun, surf, and sand touches on mental health, the immigrant experiences, and the complexities of growing up. So, thank you so much for joining us today. And also, there's so much happening in this book, particularly around the themes of anxiety. Why was this a particular subject, something that you wanted to bring to middle grade readers?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. That I would say was one of the main inspirations for me writing the book. When I came up with the idea for Kaya, we were kind of just emerging from the pandemic, and there was a lot of anxiety. Needless to say, I think heightened anxiety for everybody. But in my life, there were some children who were encountering anxiety for the first time. And when I say that, I mean like pretty severe anxiety, and it's something that I had struggled with kind of around the same age because I think that it's I suspect it's very common. The time of a middle grade reader is kind of the preteen years where there's a lot of change and there's a lot of new things which can be exciting, but can be also really scary and unnerving. And I think put that together with kind of a pandemic and that sort of thing, and it probably wasn't surprising that there was so many kids experiencing this anxiety. But it was hard to watch them go through it because it reminded me of how hard it was for me. And for me, I turned to books a lot, it's for solace and comfort. So I remember standing kind of by the ocean one night and thinking how much I would like to write a book for them because what I saw the kids going through, and I remember this too, is just especially because it's the first time and you don't really know what's happening. There's a tendency to kind of wonder like what's wrong with me, like what have I done, like why is this happening to me. And there's a lot of self-blame, there's a lot of isolation and terror. And so I was thinking I'd love to write a book where there's a main character who's going through similar struggles to kind of send a message to all these kids who are fighting this battle where no one can see that you're not alone, that there's nothing wrong with you, and that all parts of who you are still important parts of the complicated, beautiful person you are, even if you might not love all those parts or you might see them as flaws or weaknesses. So that was kind of the inspiration for it, and um, it's it was important for me to be able to write for this age because I think it's again the very first time they're doing it, and I've just always wanted to write for middle grade readers. So it was exciting to be able to do that about something that I felt strongly about.
I think it's such an important thing to write about. Like, I feel like if I'm remembering correctly, the first time that I truly felt anxiety was in that preteen moment. And I remember when I had my very first panic attack, I had no idea what was going on. I thought I was dying. I
Yeah,
was
you
just,
know,
I was just like, I can't
exactly.
breathe and the world is like ending. And it's like, what is happening? And
Right.
nobody could like explain what was happening. But like, it's a terrifying experience. And so, especially if it's your first time and you have nothing else to look at and there's no other example, I don't think I ever read a book about somebody my age experiencing anxiety before. And so I do think it's definitely something needed because so many people experience it.
I feel completely the same. I think I had a similar experience, and I do think that one thing is that, at least when I was younger, there tended to be a little bit of a taboo around the topic of mental health, and that was kind of through all parts of everything. It's definitely culturally for me and my family. I think there wasn't something that was widely accepted as being a thing you talked about, and then in books as well. Just I think it wasn't as prevalent as it luckily is becoming. You see many more shows and movies like Inside Out, and you read books about it, and I think that that's so important. I think just to be able to normalize it so that kids can see it, because just as you said, I think the first time it happens, it's new to you and you don't know, and if nobody's talking about it, you're just immediately going to kind of worst case scenarios about what's happening. So it's really helpful to have that in the conversation, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Especially because, like, when you think you're dying, it doesn't make the
Yeah.
anxiety go down.
No,
Like,
no,
suddenly,
exactly. And
like,
then
you're hyperventilating and you're like, oh my God, this is it. For whatever reason, like, I'm gonna
right,
die. And
right,
you're
right.
already freaked out, so you're freaking out more.
Right, exactly. And then if you think if you think this is like you're alone in this and like no one else is experiencing this, and then if you don't know kind of the context for it, it just makes it worse. And you end up in kind of that spiral. And that's really hard for a kid who's kind of going through that for the first time.
Yeah, because I think unfortunately there are a lot of things right now that really contribute to people having anxiety and a lot more external factors that may or may not have existed in years past. The back of book blurb mentioned the immigrant experience, which I know for a lot of people is quite scary at the moment.
Yeah.
Some people don't know, am I going to go to home and my family aren't there? Am I like, so in your book specifically, how do you deal with that particular type of anxiety?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think when I was writing the book, and obviously there's always been a lot around kind of immigration, but it was not the context it is now. So when I was writing the book, I think I was thinking a lot about um, the being a child of immigrants, which is very much my experience, and it shaped me in lots of ways. And I think that the kind of experiences that you have in terms of like isolation, alienation, kind of the feeling of displacement, that very much formed my worldview. And so I do tend in most of my books to write from that perspective. And I think partially because it's a part of who I am, and I want to be authentic, and I want to share that part of myself, but also I want to make sure that any child who has that experience kind of can see themselves reflected. Because again, as a kid, I turned to books a lot, and at the time there wasn't as much kind of in the way of um, diversity of experiences, and so I didn't see myself or my experiences or my family's experiences reflected that much. Things are changing now, which is great, but I always want to add to those voices, and to the children who don't have that experience. I'm hoping that it'll share it with them so they can see a different point of view and understand a different experience that some of their friends or their classmates might be going through. I think in Kaya of the Ocean, she is the child of immigrants as well, and she experiences kind of this the cultural tension in a couple ways. One is external. There's a scene where she's in her dad's restaurant, and there's kind of like a light. Light's the wrong word. It's like a passing microaggression scene where someone who, without ill intent, just kind of ends up kind of reminding her of their outsider status, and she has kind of thoughts about what it means to be from a different place and from a different culture and have two names and that sort of thing. So I kind of put that in there as one example of that kind of external tension. And then internally, she actually experiences her own tension because she is born in America, and she has that cultural background, but then her parents have a very different one. So that really comes kind of that um, comes to conflict when again, when they're talking about mental health, and she kind of tries to raise it, and they're very resistant to this, and it's very much kind of a reflection of like this cultural tendency to kind of um, pretend that that's okay, and that's not the thing. I always talk about how Asian parents love to fall back to, oh, if you get more sleep, you'll be fine, which is definitely my experience kind of growing up. Everything could be resolved by sleep. Um, but now you're right, with the kind of current climate, it takes on a very different tone. And I can't even imagine that additional kind of insecurity, because for all of for all of the difficulties I experienced, fear of fear of being told to leave was not one of them. Like I think I sometimes I felt like, oh, why is it that we feel like we don't belong, and why do we have to feel so alienated? But I was never in fear that I would actually be removed, and that must just, that's a whole other area that I can't even imagine. So you know, I I'm happy that I get to add to the voices and experiences of immigrants on one side, but I'm very cognizant that it definitely doesn't encapsulate like the terror that other immigrants must be feeling right now.
I think it'd be hard to do that, and especially the way publishing works, books are written years in advance before publishing dates, so it's very difficult to be prophetically writing about something that's going to be happening.
Right, very true.
But yeah, I think having a book that discusses anxiety, having a book that, opens the conversations, people can say, even if it's not a one-to-one thing where it's like, this experience is exactly what I'm feeling. Um, Understanding the physiological effects of anxiety, understanding the language you could use to describe anxiety, what the feeling might be. So even if it's a different situation, which we all experience anxiety in different ways anyway, um, knowing that language and knowing how to communicate effectively with the people around you, saying, hey, look, I'm actually feeling really anxious. Or even for people who are reading this and thinking of their friends, perhaps they can learn the language and go, hey, you know what? So and so friend might be really experiencing this particular emotion. I'm not aware of it because all of this stuff is happening. And that helps expand that empathy where they might not have been aware of it previously. And so that's something I actually really appreciate about literature and the way that we can use books like this to engage more in that type of empathetic conversation.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right, and I think that's actually you make some really excellent points that were very much in my mind when I wrote this. I about anxiety and any sort of mental health struggle being a very personal, unique, and individual thing. And so when I was writing it, I wanted to be very careful not to overgeneralize and be like, this is the universal experience with anxiety. I really wanted to make sure that it was an experience with anxiety, and also to keep it kind of as authentically true to my experience and the experience of like these children close to me as possible. But you're right, it's a you know it's a very sensitive subject. And another thing that I really wanted to try to do with this portrayal of an experience with anxiety is um, someone who had read it pointed out to me, she's like, oh, I think it's so great that on the one hand Kaya is like really put together, and she has her friends and she has her school, and she makes jokes and she's laughing, but then underneath there's all this stuff roiling, and it's and obviously you can talk about the metaphor with the ocean and all that sort of thing. But that was really gratifying to me that she had recognized that, because when I wrote it, I really did want to make sure to have that kind of dichotomy, because I think a lot of people who experience anxiety do tend to hide it, and hide it well. And so on the surface, they can seem really put together, laughing, laid back, and people sometimes don't realize like how much is happening underneath. And I wanted to make sure that that people knew that you can have both, and someone can still be hurting underneath, even if they seem completely fine.
Yeah, I feel like I might be borrowing this from, I don't know, maybe Doctor Who or something like that. I feel like David Tennant, I feel like I can imagine him saying this, but it's like you have a duck who's like perfectly calm on the water, but he's like paddling like hell underneath.
Yeah,
And I feel
yeah,
like that's kind of how a lot of anxiety is, where a lot of people I know who struggle with anxiety, they don't want anyone to know because, and I feel like that's one of the symptoms of anxiety where you don't release that tension, you don't find the safe ways to get rid of it because you're trying to hold it all
exactly,
in, and the act of holding it all in is what's making it worse.
exactly,
Um,
exactly.
and so
I
I
think,
definitely think having that experience where you're showing this person might be perfectly put together, but they are struggling. And I think especially it's a good metaphor beyond anxiety because a lot of people have other types of invisible mental or physical illnesses where they look perfectly fine, but they're in crippling pain. They're
Yeah,
struggling with different medications that may or may not be making them feel terrible that day,
right.
and so on and so forth, where everyone's got something, but just because they look fine doesn't mean they actually are fine.
No, that's completely right. That's completely right. And I think the duck metaphor is an excellent one. I think for me, part of the reason I looped in the ocean, I mean, partly I just have this fascination with the ocean, so it actually features in a lot of my stories. Um, but there is also a similar metaphor where the ocean can seem totally calm and everything's beautiful on the surface, but you have like, like a riptide underneath that's like threatening to pull you under. And I think there's a lot of that going on. I think when people are fighting these internal struggles that we can't see, it's like you see one thing on the surface and you have no idea like everything that's happening where you can't see.
So you said a couple times that the ocean is really important and meaningful to you. Can you give a little bit more about either your inspiration for the ocean or why it's so meaningful to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's always ever since I was younger, I was just fascinated by um, the idea of how vast it is, and especially if you read a lot about how little of it we've explored and how like nobody's actually been to the farthest, deepest parts of the ocean. I have the same feeling when I think about the ocean as I think when I think about space, where it's like almost mind-boggling. You almost can't keep it like the concepts in your head because it's so vast and so great and so mysterious. So I think I've always had that element of interest in it. But at the same time, I love kind of the conflicting aspects of it, where you can be by the ocean and it's so beautiful and it's so calming, and I think it brings so many people comfort and solace, and definitely for me, I love being by the ocean. But there's always this danger, and you can't tell how strong it is. You can't always predict how it'll behave. It's changeable. It feels almost alive, and I think all those things are make it so inspiring to me just as like almost as an additional character in my stories. So I think I didn't realize until someone pointed it out. I think someone was like, "Oh, you write about the ocean a lot." And I was like, "I do write about the ocean a lot, but it's it's just fascinating to me."
It's always great when people point out your quirks or the things that
Yeah.
interest you. You're not aware of it, but all of a sudden there it
Like,
is.
true. Yes. No, exactly.
Sometimes you need a little bit of exterior perspective.
Right. Right.
Well, I think the ocean's just there's a reason so many mythologies of people who live by the ocean have deities of the ocean because there's a god figure. There's when you're trying to understand how this thing works, whether you're looking at Poseidon or any of the other god figures that are about the water or the ocean, it feels like it does need something to its own thing. It has its own, it's very changeable. The way that it acts, the way that it moves. I mean, it's a fascinating phenomenon of
Yeah.
just the pressure, the wind, everything involved with it. And so like your story does have one mythology that I'm personally not familiar with, and that's with Matsu. Can you give us a little bit more on that particular aspect?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying about kind of this need to create a god or goddess to, explain this power. So I think you put that beautifully. So Matsu is a Chinese mythological water goddess who I had heard a lot about her when I was younger. My dad would tell me stories. Like she's very, very well known. In fact, she's actually still worshipped to a lot, I believe, in coastal towns in Asia. Fishermen will often kind of pray to her, for safe passage when they're on the water. I think she has like temples up in a lot of those coastal towns. She's very much a figure in Asia still. But when my dad told me stories about her, it was just more kind of like, stories to entertain a child. So I didn't know her in much context beyond there's this story about a Chinese water goddess. And then when I was starting to think about writing this story, I remembered her and I thought, I'm gonna look into her story a little bit. And it's interesting because I had actually outlined a lot of Kaya of the ocean before really delving into Matsu's story. And it was so impressive to me how coincidentally so much of her story was already kind of matching what I had outlined. And so it felt like kismet. It was like, this is fate. I have to write about this. Like there's a story about her having subdued two sidekicks who were her or two enemies who then became her sidekicks. And I'd already created two friends for Kaya, and I was like, I'm going to create a little backstory. So it was fun to be able to thread together kind of the fictional ties between the two because there was so much match already. Um, but Matsu, the story, kind of the main points of the story are that she was once a human girl, and she loved to read, but she actually wasn't a strong swimmer, and she became a stronger swimmer later when she was in her teens, I believe. And she tried to save some family members from the ocean and drowned, and then later became this Chinese water goddess. And so some of that actually I hadn't known when I was starting to write this, and I thought this was so perfect to be able to kind of tie in this like line of fictional descendants in Kaya of the Ocean. But I'm so fascinated by her because she is a kind of unique, unusual female figure who's strong and kind of barrier breaking at a time and in a space where that wasn't maybe that common. You know, she was hundreds of years ago to have a little girl who loved to read and then who kind of overcame this fear of swimming and to become this goddess and, um, you know, to kind of be able to subdue enemies and make them their friends. Like I think there were a lot of inspiring parts of her that were fascinating, and I really wanted to be able to kind of bring that into the modern day to this little 13-year-old girl who is suffering from anxiety.
It's really interesting that you say that. This is the first time I've heard the story, so forgive me if I've got the details wrong.
No, no.
Um, so she ended up drowning, and then she became a water goddess because she drowned.
Yes, kind of.
How does that work exactly, where somebody drowns, but then even though they died then that way, they became the deity of that thing?
Yeah, I think it might be because it was also so many hundreds of years ago. Um I think that was kind of I suspect, and this is I don't want to overstep because I'm sure someone who studies Chinese mythology could probably give a better example. But I think that this was one of those stories where there are records of this kind of human girl who went through this, and then it kind of became this fable of this Chinese water goddess. So I think there's maybe like a break between the two, um, but it's also I think similar to stories hard to tell which came first. Like, was there a Chinese water goddess and then the stories came afterwards, or was there this girl first and then that was a little more nebulous. But I think that many of the kind of agreed upon stories of Matsu's ascent is along those lines, which is why I was like, okay, this is a beautiful story. But of course, Matsu in the story didn't have children or descendants. So when I was creating my story and I wanted to create this secret line of descendants, I had to start with a scene where that happens, and it happens through kind of a vehicle of magic. And then there's a scene later in the book where Kaya and her two friends are trying to figure out what's going on, and they kind of read some of the backstory. And one of the friends does ask, she's like, "How can there be descendants if she has no children?" So I wanted to make sure that it was like for anyone who's reading that they do understand that there's like this fictional line of descendants, but there's a lot of kind of her lore that is woven in, and then the rest kind of becomes fictionalized.
I think it's one of the joys of being able to play with both history and also literature, mythology, all these different things is that these are all stories that we're telling one way or the other. They might have realistic things. I mean, even I'm a historian in my day job, and I'll flat out
Oh,
say
cool.
that the histories that we only get them because of the evidence that we have. If that evidence is modified, if it's falsified, if it's incomplete, we might not have the full picture. It also depends who wrote that evidence down. I mean, somebody could have said Matsu is 15 years old. Someone could have said Matsu is 30 years old. And whichever one becomes popularized is how we get the history. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying that's the type of history that we get. And
Hmm.
so it's definitely a fun way of playing with it in a fiction sense of being able to say, hey, we've played a little bit with this. We're not sure what happened because it's absolutely possible that something might have changed over time or that a different story came out, and this is how we're going to continue that story through another act of storytelling.
Right, right. No, I like that a lot. I completely agree. And even that is very much kind of the experience what I did when I was doing some research into her was like a lot of it was like um, some people say this, some people say this. There's generally agreed upon this, but there was a lot of it was so long ago. There was a lot of um, hedging, I would say, like what was accepted and what wasn't. So I kind of took like the most common threads and try to incorporate those.
Well, the other side that's really fun is being able to mention it and then inspire people to go and look up more and having them
Yes.
go. He's like, if you like this character, there's so many other things you can go and look at and having them go and do the research and find out more for themselves later.
Agreed, agreed. And that's actually because when I was young, I think a lot of what we studied in English classes was Greek mythology, which is there are so many beautiful stories, and we would study that. And it's funny because, as you said, it's I feel like mythology is already a story, kind of trying to explain certain phenomenon and historical events that couldn't be explained, and then from that, sometimes there would be additional stories. And I think there's been some great kind of Greek mythology reduxes almost, and I love all of those. But I wanted to kind of like introduce a new voice to some extent. I mean, there had been so many wonderful Chinese mythological stories. I hadn't read any about Matsu, and no, which is not to say there isn't any, but I hadn't seen her kind of prominently featured, so I wanted to be able to like throw her hat in the ring for her a little bit, if you will.
That's awesome. So excited. What do you find, or what would you like for people who see Matsu for the first time to take away from your story?
I guess I would love, as I said, I think I love the fact that she is kind of this strong female figure in a space where that wasn't very common. And I'd like to, I'd like for her to have recognition for that. But so many parts of her story are really inspiring, and I think feed in well kind of to this story I would love middle grade readers to know, which is that she started out one way, with this fear and overcame it, especially when it came to trying to save her loved ones, and um, that she was reading as a child hundreds of years ago when that couldn't have been well accepted. So she was breaking barriers there, and just like her ability to kind of bring people together, I think is all of those things are really inspiring, and I think are great things to look up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you mentioned earlier that you really wanted to write a middle grade story. Why did you really want to write a middle grade story as opposed to young adult, adult, or a different age gap altogether?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think I would say that I started kind of writing adult literary fiction and short stories, as you mentioned in your intro, and that was kind of where I was trained. So I think that that was my initial comfort zone. And I do love writing all genres. So, but the reason that middle grade has such a special place in my heart, I think, is because, as I mentioned, for me, middle grade books were really kind of the gateway into my love of reading. Like that was a time where I really, some of my earliest favorite books are the middle grade books that have really stayed with me. And they meant so much to me at a time that could feel tumultuous to a lot of kids, and certainly did to me. So um, it's always been my dream to kind of like add to that canon and to be able to like reach those kids who are looking for, either reassurance and see themselves reflected back in these stories, or curiosity and understanding other people's stories. I think that it's such a special age to write for. They're preteens, so they're kind of on the cusp of being cynical, skeptical teenagers, and they can be such sophisticated readers. So you definitely don't want to be talking down to them, but at the same time, they're young enough to still have kind of an openness to the idea of magic, at least in stories. So it's a really fun age to write for, but it's an important age to write for, I think.
What do you think one of the biggest differences between writing for an adult audience versus a middle grade audience is?
That's a great question. It's actually one I've been thinking about a lot recently because I think there's two categories of differences. One is the writing. As I mentioned, they're a very unique kind of reader group with kind of a reader group that you want to write for in terms of making sure that it's sophisticated and plot driven and everything that an adult would want to read that is there engaging them. Um, but at the same time, they also do speak differently than us. So, when I write dialogue, I'm really careful to try and capture something that would sound authentic and true. And I do enlist a lot of kids in my life, especially including my own, to kind of say, like, does this sound like something someone would say, like, to make sure that it rings true, because there is kind of that gap in how we talk. So there's definitely that writing aspect of how to write for them. Then there's also the marketing aspect, which I hadn't thought about until after my book was released. But unlike a lot of my writer friends who are writing in older genres, when you write for middle grade, you're writing for a different target readership than is the decision maker, if that makes sense. So when you write for middle grade readers, I can't go into social media because thank goodness most of them are not on social media and I can't reach them that way. And a lot of times they're not the main decision makers of what to buy. You know, they might in the bookstore wander around and their parents might hear, but a lot of times it's the parents and the librarians and the teachers and the booksellers who are kind of deciding what should be pushed to the kids. And so um, sometimes like things like school visits will help, but it's really an interesting experience writing for a different group of people than the decision makers and hoping that the decision makers end up thinking that it's a worthy book to bring to their kids. But there is a step removed, which I hadn't thought about until I was trying to reach them.
No, now that you mention it, I feel like I was vaguely aware of that, but it's not something I like really focus on because my target audience are adult readers. And so, but you're absolutely right. Like the people who are buying it are different from the people who are actually consuming it.
Yes.
Which does make me think of something you said earlier in this interview, where you said that your parents had a very different perspective on mental health. And
Hmm.
so, if you're trying to get this book into the hands of somebody who might be potentially experiencing anxiety, but the decision makers are people who don't believe anxiety is something to talk about or even mention, how do you breach that barrier to make sure the readers who could be most affected by the book actually get the book?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think one answer is that I feel at least a little, I feel like the needle has moved since I was younger, which thank goodness. I think it's, I mentioned that there's like Inside Out, Turning Red. There's a lot of pop culture and art now that kind of centers on the idea of anxiety, which I think and hope is driven by, parents and teachers and caregivers who realize that this is something that kids want to see represented, they want to talk about, they want to be out in the open. So I am hopeful that, even if the kids aren't the decision makers, and even if they were, maybe they wouldn't know to pick up a book about anxiety. That now parents and teachers and librarians and booksellers they know and they say like this is part of the conversation that we should be having. I think the other thing that is helpful again is school visits, which I think is very big in the middle grade author world and something that I'd actually quickly learned about as soon as it was released. That I think I suspect young adult also does that, but it's obviously not something that adult authors do. But just the ability to go to a school, talk a little bit about the book, and maybe read a section of it, and it's so gratifying, I think, to do that and to have children come up and be really excited and want to know more. And I think that's for them, it's part of it. I think for them, they're very plot driven. They want to know like what happens at the end of the scene, like what happens with this character. And I think the rest of it kind of falls in after that. But that's one way that a lot of middle grade authors will reach their audience.
No, I think that's really cool because I vaguely remember authors coming in and sitting in the library and just being mystified by this. I'm sure I thought they were the most famous person in the world because they were coming in and they had published a book. And I don't know if they were or not. I actually can't remember their names, but I remember sitting there just being so stupefied by like, they wrote the thing. The thing is, a physical thing and being just
Yeah.
it's mystifying. You feel like they're just someone so the voice of God is speaking to you.
Yeah, no, that's so funny you should say that because I will say before my first school visit, I was terrified. I write for kids. I think they're such an important reader group, but I have kids, I know kids, and I know that they can be tough. They can be tough critics. So I was very afraid. I wasn't sure what kinds of questions they'd ask. I wasn't sure if they'd be interested, but it was amazing. They were both, they were engaged. They asked the most insightful questions. I was so impressed with them. But the best moment came afterwards, and your story reminded me of this where this little girl ran into the kind of auditorium after it was over, and she had a little eraser and a Sharpie, and she's like, "I don't have anything for you to sign. Will you sign my eraser?" And I am 1,000% sure that is the closest I will ever get to feeling like a rock star. So I was like, "I sure will sign your eraser," and it was completely illegible because it was a Sharpie. It looks like a blob, but it was just such a sweet moment. She was clearly so excited. I was very excited. It was like the best.
15 years from now, that kid's going to be a best-selling author, and it was because
Yeah.
you inspired her.
And I hope she keeps that blob on that eraser that is completely illegible. It was great though.
Absolutely. I know if it was me, I would absolutely have kept it forever.
I would too. I was very into like little souvenirs like that.
Oh, absolutely. Um, how do you go about like physically doing the school visits? Are they all local? Do you travel out to visit them? Like, what is your range as far as doing these visits?
That's a good question. So every author will do it a little bit differently. For me, I've stayed local, and the way that it's organized is usually organized by the publisher with the help of a local bookstore. So the local bookstore kind of handles all like the books and the book selling, and they advertise a little bit beforehand if the kids want a book signed by the author there. Sometimes they buy some after, but it's for me, it's been local and it's kind of been like arranged by that group of supporting people. I do know some authors will go travel and do book school visit tours. I think that's great. I think if you kind of can swing that schedule wise and just getting on everyone on board with that, I think that's probably very helpful. I know some authors too, and they're the ones that are more built up with a built up audience. They actually almost do school visits almost as like a business. So they'll take a fee for it, and they have like a you can reach out through an agent for it, and it's much more kind of streamlined and business-like. I think I did not do that because as a debut, I think for me it was just more important to be able to just to be there and just have a presence and reach the kids. So it's been
Well,
a good experience. Yeah.
it helps that you're in the San Francisco Bay Area. I feel like there's a lot of schools there.
Yes, that's true. If that is a good point. If I was somewhere less populous, I would probably have to think about traveling more. But I'm lucky that there's a lot of schools close by. So.
So is there anything that you were surprised about when it came to writing this book that you either weren't anticipating or just kind of appeared and you just kind of had to go with it?
Yeah, actually there was something. I There were two aspects of the book that presented more of a challenge than I was expecting, and actually ended up changing a lot from the first draft to the final draft. One was Kaya's mother. In the early drafts, I think anyone with an Asian immigrant mother can probably attest to the fact that their love can really border between like incredibly fierce but also very very strict. So she had a certain persona where she was very strict, and I had some beta readers read it, and a couple of them came back and were saying, oh my God, Kaya's mom is so cruel and cold. And that was horrifying to me because that's not at all how I meant her to be. So I really had to work hard to kind of soften her edges to make sure her like fierce love for Kaya shone through. And it wasn't just kind of just strictness, because I didn't mean for her to turn into a parody. So that was something, that a challenge that I wasn't expecting, because I had written her one way in my mind and then she came out having a very different effect. So I needed to like adjust that. The other thing that changed a lot was Tayo, who is the boy that Kaya has a sort of crush on, and he kind of likes her back. And the first rounds of the story, that was actually a much more prominent part of the story. And I realized at some point that at this point in Kaya's life, the true loves of her life are actually her best friends, Naomi and Iolana. And the quasi romance with Tayo was actually distracting from it. So I worked really hard to kind of mute that and make that more like the promise of a crush rather than like a full blown relationship. So those two things changed the story a lot and were kind of unexpected challenges, because I hadn't seen that those would have to be tweaked so much.
I have to admit though, I feel like that rings so much more authentic as far as like the love relationship where when you're in your middle grade, your friends are like your ride or die, like you said in your blurb, like these are your people.
Yes.
And yeah, you could have a crush on somebody, but your friends are your friends, like they're the people.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's what I realized. Like they play a huge part in her journey, not just as friends, but also kind of like coming to terms with how she can find these coping mechanisms for her anxiety, and they end up being kind of a huge part of that. So I really wanted to make sure that the spotlight remained on them and wasn't kind of distracted by the romance, which was cute. But you're right. At that age, I think it's much more about your friends.
So before I let you go today, I just wanted to ask one final question, which is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you would like to share?
Yeah, I was. That's a great question. I was thinking recently, actually, how one thing that I've realized since the book came out is how amazing it feels to have children reach out to me and tell me that they love the book. And I think as authors, you know, a positive review feels good no matter what, like whoever it's from, whether an adult or a professional reviewer. But there is something so sweet about hearing from a child. And, you know, like recently, one of my friends sent me a video of her daughter who had finished the book, and she was jumping up and down and she was so excited. She wanted to know what happened here, and she wanted to know if there'd be a second book because she wanted, you know, to find out more about this. And the feeling of reaching a child that way, was so meaningful to me because, you know, again, for me, I still remember some of those books that made such an impact on me. I can still remember scene by scene. I can remember the characters. So to be able to kind of have that effect, or like a little, you know, tiny portion of having that effect, is just like, it's like magical. So that's one thing I wanted to share. Was I hadn't experienced obviously until the book was released, but that's my favorite thing, I think.
That's amazing. It really is. But I do have to follow up. Do you have any plans to do a sequel or to continue Kaya's story?
That's, you know, I love that question. I currently don't. I did sell another book, but and it's not been announced yet, so hopefully I can share more about it soon. But it's not yeah, but it's not actually related to Kaya's story. I would definitely be open to it. The way I wrote it, it's not a cliffhanger, it ends, but there was a tiny opening for a story later, but I think it really kind of just depends on how things fall, you know, but not currently at the time. But if I ever do, I have an entire notepad that my friend sent me a screenshot of from her daughter with all her ideas. And it was so cute. I was like, well, if I do write this, she will definitely be getting an acknowledgement because these are great ideas.
That's wonderful. And I wish you all the luck with your next book, no matter
Thank
what
you
it
so much.
is.
Thank you so
And
much.
if you do continue Kaya, best of luck with that as well.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode of Lindsay Bird in Writing is Hard. Gloria Huang's book, Kaya of the Ocean, is currently available. You can check the description for more about her and where to find her book. If you enjoyed this content, please do like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to make you more. Bye for now.